Hi there everyone, welcome back to another video here with me, Jennifer Kirk. And today we've got something special again, following on from the big winter scene build that we did. This is a follow-up to that, and we thought what would be something that would really show off what you can do in model form really well. And actually with the rise of O-Gauge, it's something that I think a lot of people have said the O-Gauge is lovely, it's a really good price, but I haven't got the space to run it. Well, think again, because today, with approximately 7 hours worth of build, I'm going to show you that you do have space for an O-Gauge layout. Moreover, it needn't cost you too much money. So first things first, baseboards is where it's all beginning from, and you can build your own baseboards. We've shown you in previous episodes methods of constructing those, but with this I wanted to recycle stuff. Now I had a baseboard already available out in the shed from my old layout, Bolton Trinity Road, and I was looking to recycle as much of that as possible. So after I cleaned the track and all of the scenic stuff off, what we ended up with was slightly messy baseboards, but they were fairly flat and able to be the brilliant starting point to be able to build this small layout. I've actually cut off part of it here. It originally jutted out, and then the bridge where the doorway was there, so that was into the corner by the door. And I had some mill buildings on the end there. You can just about see the outline, and these were the dead end sidings. There are actually 3 points originally on here, but you can see that this is not double O. This is some spare O-Gauge track I had left over from doing the garden layout, and I've just plain lined one of the points out in the garden layout, and you can see here, here's the point that's come back in. I've test fitted a Pico motor onto there, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use one of the existing holes. I'm going to put that in, and then I'm going to build up some track, and what I just want is a very basic kind of a scenic model that I can then do some photography on when I'm reviewing O-Gauge models. So I'm just going to test fit a load of stuff. I need to glue some card over the unused holes just to make sure that I don't then end up with a big hole that ballast falls through. And I guess I'm going to have a line across the front, the point in the middle with 2 sidings up there, and then another bit of line going here. There'd be a scenic break, probably a bridge, because bridges are great for scenic breaks. And I'll put a backboard on at some point and just generally build it up. Now in terms of size, it's not very big. It's about 3'6" by maybe 18 inches to 20 inches at most wide. So it's actually very easy to move around, to store out of the way. And principally I wanted to build this to actually show off O-Gauge models in a controlled environment where we could film them and photograph them. But it has been built specifically to be a small shunting layout of the kind that you might see at model railway exhibitions. Once we got the baseboards together, one of the things that I felt was important was to put together a back seam. I didn't have a piece of plywood that was big enough to do the entire back in one go, so I've made do with 2 lengths glued together and screwed on. These also give the entire model a lot of rigidity, and they ensure that there's much less flex, and it also protects a lot of the scenery. For either end, well, you can add a back scene here too, and I've managed to scrounge enough wood to do the back scene on one end, but I've left the other end open, and this is twofold. Firstly, because I didn't have the materials to hand to build it, but also it allows a conduit in for the camera angles to be able to get some really interesting shots of rolling stock. You can make the back scenes on the end out of pretty much anything that you have to hand. I've used some 6mm ply for the end that I've added a back scene to, and this was just lying around as scrap. You could also use 2mm mounting card. Just got to remember that it's not structural, so you have to protect it from getting knocks and bangs. If you make these ends removable, it also facilitates photography as well. So first things first, had some spare track left over from building my garden railway, and I thought that this would be perfect for the job. It's the Pico track. I've used their flexible O-gauge track as well as a single uni-track point which I had left over, and it seemed a great idea to use this as well. Now I had some electrical stuff, including a PL10 motor, which was perfect to motorise this point. I guess a lot of people think that O-gauge needs special equipment, and actually it doesn't. The Pico points will take a standard Pico PL10 point motor. So in terms of the track laying, I kept it very, very basic. I didn't want such a small board to become completely overwhelmed by track. So what I've done is I've got a Y-shaped set of sidings. There's two short sidings plumbed into that point, leading to a track that goes off scene. And then in turn as well, we've got alongside that a kind of a mainline track which goes the full width of the board. And then I've decided that what I'm going to do is a scenic break either end, just to kind of give an idea that this is part of a much larger railway. And indeed, you could then go on and build extra modules to extend this if you really wanted to. Once the track was down, it's down to electrics. Now, I'm not a big fan of electrics, and I guess a lot of you guys aren't either. So I kept them fairly simple. I've wired this layout up such that you can use it with either DCC or DC, whatever takes your fancy. And actually the wiring for both of these is fairly similar. Just make sure you've got plenty of droppers from each bit of track, all wired together to a central collecting point, as it were. So we've been back on with this. We've got the electrics done underneath. Now, it's my patented rat's nest effort. But it works. I've got track droppers soldered in, all coming back to a chock block. I've got an isolating section in just because. CDU is wired into the output of the point motor, but I've yet to get a switch to be able to change the point. It is changing the frog polarity through this PL13, Pico PL13 switch. So it's all very simple electrics. I also added in an isolating section for one of the sidings, and this means that if you're going to run this on DC, you can have a second locomotive on the layout whilst you're operating it, and it just adds that extra bit of operational interest. I've used the standard Pico PL20 isolating switch for this. Again, it's all the kind of basic equipment that you'd have lying around from an N gauge or a double O gauge layout. So far, the only thing that's special to this for O-gauge is the track. Once you've got the electrics all in there and tested, and this is pretty basic, so actually there's not a lot to test. It worked first time, every time. It's time to start thinking about building up the scenery. And what I wanted to do was to utilise stuff that I had to hand. So yes, you can get bespoke buildings in O-gauge, but that would cost you. So my aim for this was to use up things that I had left over from building my large double O-gauge layout weir yard in the loft. And so I chose to use the Metcalf card kits. Now ostensibly these are being sold for use in double O. But the retaining walls and the sloped retaining walls are actually, in my opinion, really good for more than just double O scale. They're really easy to build up, and actually most of the build time, that 7-hour build time for this layout, went into building these card kits. Easy enough to do, but can get quite repetitive. Got the sloped versions, and also I've still got to make a whole load of the high-level versions. And I think these are a brilliant kit. They're one of my favourite Metcalf kits for the ease at which they go together, and also the effectiveness of the end model itself. Now, one of the other things as well is that the actual height that we get up to there isn't enough for the bridge that I want to put as the scenic break. So I'm just going to move that locomotive to there, and you can see that actually the wall is a little bit on the low side. So what I'm planning is to use some balsa wood to raise that up. I can then use some plaster cloth to kind of just put a little bit of a slope on this side to hide that balsa wood, and then behind it just means that the slope is slightly taller. I'm then going to use some of the Wills Vary girder to build a girder that comes across here. I'm going to build another piece of walling here to match, and that's going to provide a really nice scenic break at the edge of the baseboard. Now, you could build a fiddle yard if you wanted, or another module, but what I would plan to do if I ever ran this as a layout is probably something like a loco cassette, just to be able to take stuff away. For me, this is more about being able to photograph models than to actually run trains, but I know an awful lot of people really do like these little tiny shunting layouts. So essentially it gives you a lot of flexibility. I chose to use the Metcalf card kits. Now, ostensibly, these are being sold for use in 00, but the end result, as I'm sure you'll agree, is actually pretty good. And when you see them up against an O-gauge wagon or locomotive, they actually don't look out of scale. And this brings us on to quite an important thing to deal with O-gauge. You don't need to buy specific scenery materials for O-gauge, and it doesn't need to be expensive. These kits are actually pretty affordable, and even somebody who doesn't enjoy building kit buildings like myself it was quite easy to get into the flow and build these up. Once you've got a few of them handy, it's always as well to test fit around the layout. And the balsa wood is in. I've glued and screwed it as well, just to stop it from warping. Test fitted, that's raised it just enough so that we've got the clearance above the locomotive for the Wills Vary girder. It's going to be a really tight fit, very low clearance bridge, but it's going to be fine for the application that I want. If you needed more clearance, then it's easy enough to add an extra layer of scrap balsa wood just to bring that retaining wall up a little bit. One thing I've done before gluing this in is I've given a quick coat of the brown emulsion that I like to use as part of the ground cover just onto that balsa wood. Now, the reason for this is just to hide any areas where it might show through for whatever reason. Hopefully it won't, but it just makes it much easier to hide, and you can get a much neater job, obviously, painting it before this is then glued on. I've glued it on with the Speed Bond Deluxe Materials product. It's pretty good for applications like this. I have a love-hate relationship with the Deluxe Materials Speed Bond. It does have good uses, and this is one of them. So I'm going to let that dry, and then once that is dry and firm, I can start building up the landform behind it. And what I'm going to do with this is just some scrunched up paper and just try and get the basic shape. And once that's in, perhaps hold it in with a bit of tape just to stop it from pushing back out. I want this area at the back to become a hillside. So that provides an excellent opportunity to get a much higher hillside that fits in with the architecture of the railway in a way that really just looks right and leads up to the bridge that I'm going to plan on building on the right-hand side of the layout. I also used some other bits and pieces. I had the top part of a sloped retaining wall, plus a number of the high-level retaining walls, and these were perfect for building in around the other end of the layout. You can also see there I've used some screws with some washers just to try and hold this newspaper back into position. What I don't want is it springing out when we put the plaster bandage layer on. And what I'll be doing is trying to, at this stage, work a kind of a hillside, fairly steep-sided hillside, but basically a sense that the landscape goes up to the back scene, and that will also hide a good deal of this gap as well. And what the ultimate plan for that hillside is to use some of the Woodland Scenics trees that we've got and make up some of those, because actually the thing about O gauge is that an awful lot of these materials are good for pretty much any scale. So even though they're notionally they're actually for HO scale, work equally as well with double O. But in O gauge, well, trees come in all different sizes, so they just look like smaller trees. And that will just help build up this hillside, put some bushes in. I want it really nice and overgrown so that we've got a good backdrop for when I photograph locomotives, rolling stock here at the front. We'll have that scene going away in the background, and I won't need too much of a kind of a sense of what's going on in the background, because those trees will cover an awful lot of it. Well, I've prepped the plaster bandages by filling up the container that they came in with water, because I'm going to be using the last of these, so I'm not too bothered about having somewhere to store leftovers, because I'm not envisaging them being any. And I've also cut up the sheets in advance. This is important. Don't try and cut them whilst your hands are covered in water and plaster, because you'll just make an unholy mess. Preparation is key. So I've cut all these up into little strips, and that will hopefully just aid me to get a layer over all of this. I'm hoping that I've got enough to do that, but I'm going to have to go very carefully. I'm trying to be very economic here, using materials that I already have to hand. So let's just crack on and see where we get to. Now, this is a technique that I showed you quite extensively during the build of the winter scene for Hornby, which is actually just over there in storage. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the techniques that I'm using here. If you need to learn more, we've got some links that will take you back to that winter diorama scene, and no doubt we'll be able to cut just a little bit of that plaster bandage work in, just to show you the techniques that we're going to be using. At this stage, you don't have to be too precise. It's just simply a case of getting that covering onto the model. So I think, are we ready, Les?
We're ready. Yeah.
Right. Well, I shall soak it, let it drip, and then we just start building it up, and then you kind of smooth it. And the trick I find is you've got to smooth it until you don't get those little holes. Isn't that right, Les?
Yeah,
you just kind of
and push it into this, the paper, and everything, so it all becomes like one congealed.
Yeah.
I've cut my pieces slightly smaller than Jen, but it's personal taste.
I used the plaster bandage cut up into pieces over the top of scrunched up newspaper. If you've got something like offcuts of foam insulation, you can use those instead. I was just using what I had. And there's a few little tips you can use to try and get it into shape. And we used some of those in the previous build when we did the winter scene. And Les showed us how to wet that underlying paper that was being used, just enough to make it easier to mould. And these are all the same techniques that I've used here. Once I've put the plaster bandage over the top, what I actually found was that I ran out. I didn't have enough to complete this build. So rather than going out and spending more money on more products, this seemed like an excellent opportunity to show you guys a different method, which was actually suggested to me on the Monday live stream by Alan Reynolds. So big up Alan Reynolds if you're watching this. And he suggested that actually cheap blue-white checked J cloth soaked in PVA glue makes an excellent alternative. And I've used it before in the past actually, and it does. So I finished off the hillside with a layer of that. It does take longer to dry than the plaster, which is a chemical reaction and just sets. So it did mean that it was a good chance to take a break whilst that set and finish off building some of those retaining walls. Once that was all down and dried, it was the tried and tested method of getting the ground cover in. I ballasted the track using the Pico ballast, and I chose to go for the ash and cinder ballast, mostly because I had a bag of this lying around, but also because I wanted this to look a bit grotty, and I prefer the darker look of the ballast. I also used a bag of ground up coal dust, again from the Pico set of products, and that actually blended in quite well. And I treated the siding area to the bulk of that because I thought that was the kind of place where that kind of muck and grot would accumulate. The rest of the scenery was actually pretty simple, and it's the same method I've been using in 00 extensively. And I always tell people my secret ingredient is kiln dried sand. And I've got a Quality Street tub there full of the stuff, and you can see, as we've highlighted in previous episodes, it's absolutely bone dry, and that's important to be able to work with it. If it gets wet, you just can't do anything with it at all. But I start off giving the ground cover a coat of this water-based brown household emulsion, and it doesn't really matter what shade of brown. This is almost like a chocolate or a cappuccino brown. In fact, it's probably got a fancy name on there somewhere, but that's not actually important. I've seen a lot of people debate about what's best to have as the base colour, and some people advocate green, but I always argue thus. Soil is brown, so no matter how much grass you put over the top, green looks unnatural, brown looks natural. And to give it the right texture, because texture, in my view, is almost as important as colour, I add that sand over the top whilst that paint is still wet, and then spray it down with a watered down mix of PVA and water. You can see there in an old Windowline or Dettol type container. Just carefully spray that over the top. Keep it nice and wet. And this is important because as each subsequent layer goes on, you need that moisture for it to stick to the scenery. The thing about scenery that you really need to pay attention to is not just the colours, but the textures. The eye does see the texture. And by adding that sand over the top of the paint, you're giving the ground a texture just like real terrain. I then spray liberally with watered down PVA and start building up the actual coloured ground scene. Partway through doing the ground cover, and you can see here, just building up the different colours and textures, and it's what I say in a lot of my other videos. Colours and textures are king in building up realistic ground cover. The real world is full of so many different subtle shades, textures. It really does benefit from a whole host of different materials, different colours. So we've got in there the Pico woodland ground cover, which is, I've extolled the virtues of this product over and over again, and that gives us a good texture and colour mix. And then on top of that, we've used a number of different Woodland Scenics products, Pico products, Gauge Master products, and it really does come together. And the trick is use as many different shades as you have available to produce the colours you want. So we've got from the Pico Scene range, Woodland Ground Cover, PS400. I love this stuff. It's a really, really good product. And especially when you're going to be laying it in an area where there's trees, it does give a very good effect underneath them. These are the three Woodland Scenics products that I've been using. Burnt grass, fine turf, earth, fine turf, and yellow grass, fine turf. Now these are all quite a fine material, but they give some subtle different shades within the landform, and I think that's really important. And also static grass, PSG 222 2mm summer grass. I've decided to use some of this, and I've mixed into it as well some 4mm autumn grass. Don't have the packet for that to hand. And that gives the longer length fibres for the grass, and you don't need a static grass applicator for this. It just, I find it just rubbing them through your fingers is enough to impart that static charge. And you'll see as well on the retaining wall, some of the scatter, I've purposefully allowed it to remain there. It's brought about by the fact that I spray a lot of watered down PVA glue around. It does dry completely clear, so you'd never notice afterwards, but I utilise it to get some of the flock, some of the static grass stuck to the walls, and that gives you an excellent representation of overgrown, down at heel structures that nature has started to colonise, and it's a really good effect which you can see has really worked well in this area. So when you're spraying the glue, it doesn't matter if you get some overspray, because the scatter will stick in it and start to look like a build-up of vegetation and moss, just like the real thing. At every point of this, a quick spray over with the watered-down PVA just makes sure that it all sticks in place. I like to do this in one continuous run, but it doesn't matter too much if you want to come back and add to it over a period of time. Both methods work really, really well and give much the same results. I just tend to like to do things quite quickly, hence my nickname, the Queen of Speed Modelling. The final layer to go on was from the Woodland Scenics range, and just a few little clusters of this kind of low bushy material, which is very similar to the foliage that I use subsequently for the trees. And this just gives a sense of a three-dimensional vegetation, which I think really does bring a scene to life. When it comes to the trees for this build, I've again chosen the Woodland Scenics range of tree making kits. They're not necessarily the most detailed trees on the market, but they're fairly inexpensive for what they are, and the big plus is A, I already had these, and B, anybody with any skill level can create a really good result with them. They are consistent and easy to do, so you don't need to be overwhelmed with the thought of what if I make a mess. These tree making kits I find really good, and what I've done is I've used 3 different types of foliage for these trees when I've made them up. The armatures just twist into shape. It's a really, really versatile springy plastic which holds its shape once you've twisted them to the right variety of poses that you want. I've then chosen the clump foliage, which is very similar to what we talked about going on the ground cover. I've also used the fine leaf foliage, which appears to be an organic-based product, but I think gives an immensely good effect. The final product that I've tried using is more of a matte that's impregnated with a fine dusty scatter. I find of the 3, this is probably the hardest to use, but the end results seem okay. It's not my favourite, but again, it goes back to what I said before. Getting that variety of colours and textures is important to make a model railway look realistic. Final stages, well, I used some Will's Vari Girder kits to make up some bridge girders for either end of this layout. Again, these are ostensibly sold for 00, but actually they're equally useful for a number of other scales. And shown here in O gauge, I'm sure you'll agree that actually they work really, really well. I've chosen to paint them up with a matte dark olive green colour, and the reason for this is that I find that matte coloured paint gives a much better finish in model form and just looks right. I tend to steer clear of gloss. It just never really looks right to me in model form, and if you need something that in real life would be gloss, I tend to say use the satin finish. These colours are from the Humbrol range. I used number 91 for the bridge girders. This is my personal favourite ever since number 108 was deleted from the range. This is a close approximation. I've also painted up the buffer beams. One of these was actually ready assembled and featured in a very early how-to video that I did a number of years ago. Well, it's finally found a permanent home on this layout. The other buffer was still in kit form and I've assembled it up. Both are from the Pico range and they do produce a pretty nice buffer stop. I've painted the front boards in a matte white colour, again from the Humbrol range, and the little red lens on the lamp I've used a satin red from the Humbrol range, but actually it's not massively important which colours you use, and really it's a case of I used these because these were the colours that I already had. So now you can see the final finished layout is pretty good. It's not very big, it's certainly portable with one person, and it provides an excellent backdrop for your O gauge stock. So actually, any cries of, I love this new O gauge coming out ready to run, it's really affordable but I don't have the space to run it. Yes, you do. And I've just shown you how in 7 hours to make that a reality. Well, I hope that video has been really informative to you, and maybe that's inspired you to give a small model railway like this a go, especially for some of these senior scales which you might have thought you didn't have the room for. Don't forget to like this video and share it too. Let everybody else know about these little projects that I'm putting together on my YouTube channel. And really, really important, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, tickle that subscribe button and you'll be the first to know about new videos as and when they go up. But until next time, this is me, Jenny Kirk, saying thanks for your company. It's been great having you watch me do this project. And you take really good care. See you next time. Bye for now. Today's video has been brought to you in part thanks to the generous donation of my fans on Patreon. And a huge thanks goes out to Anthony Kidson, Michael Churchwood, Alec Ralph, Anthony Hunt, William Wade, Wayne Johns, Offshore Alan, oorail.co.uk and Tepic. Today's video has been brought to you by my books, Bringing Home the Stars, Twinkle Little Star, and also you can get the complete comic collections of All Over the House, Books 1, Books 2, and also the wacky zany Life of Knob T Mouse. Thanks and catch you later.